Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock. You can get me at 960 AM on the AM dial, or you can stream us online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and videocasts on my website, briancrombie.com, either /videocasts or podcasts. I've got a really interesting gentleman back with us tonight, Lindsay Blackett. Lindsay was on just about a month ago on a panel of different people from around North America talking about the protests in the United States and the riots and Black Lives Matter and what was happening. And I wanted to delve into it a little bit further because Lindsay's got really quite an illustrious background. He is a Canadian politician, was a member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, representing the constituency of Calgary Northwest as a progressive conservative. He used to be, I think, Lindsay, in Ontario as well, and you were involved here as well, if I'm not mistaken. And
yes.
And you've been involved in community activities, and you've been an activist for quite a long period of time.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're forced to be.
So tell me, it's been about a month since we talked last. Does this protests, do these protests in the United States and in Canada, do they have legs? Are we gonna forget about what happened in Minneapolis, or is this gonna have some meaningful change in our society?
I think it has legs. And an article I wrote to an op-ed to the Calgary Herald a couple of weeks ago, I had oversaw my daughter and son were 22 and 19, brilliant young people going at each other over who is right and who is wrong in this. And I said, well, this is all great that you're passionate, but this stuff has been going on for so long. I've been watching it for 60 years. I said, I think the change now is that the generation that is millennials and younger have realized that it has to change. They've already changed their attitudes. Their parents' attitudes haven't changed as much. So it's basically come down to there's one election left for us old farts who are the baby boomers that have any influence to do anything right. We'll either do it between now and the next election, or we're going to be forgotten part of history.
What do you mean there's one election left?
Because we're dying. The millennials, they're not, the people that are 54 years and older, every election, there's a lot of them that pass away.
Yeah.
The millennials by themselves outnumber the amount of baby boomers that are there. The people that are 17 to 22 outnumber the amount of baby boomers that are there. They have the votes and they have the inclination to make change. We don't, as our generation, we've just saw it go by, whether it's Rodney King or it's Mr. Floyd, or it was many other Americans, and we just sat by and watched it. We never changed our institutions. They never changed their institutions. Now you're starting to see people talk about defunding police, and I'm not advocating for that. I'm advocating for the fact that police, they're supposed to be there to serve and protect. And if they're not doing that, whether you're in the United States or in Canada, there's a time to reevaluate their terms of reference. And that is coming home to roost. We're also seeing the educational system, people starting to attack the systemic problems that happen with respect to, I remember being in Ontario at the general level courses that would get you into shop class, but you knew you could never get into college or university. And a lot of people from different colors were pushed into those segments. I think a lot of people have just gotten tired of that and said, we need to make some changes. And I think people are sick of protests. I think there's majority of the population are not in favor of it. I understand why people are prompted to do it. What they want to know is, how can I help make change?
I spoke to a gentleman by the name of Denham Jolly, 85-year-old gentleman who came from Jamaica originally. And he was saying that the education in Jamaica was different because as a Black person growing up in Jamaica, you were told you could be anything. You could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, you could achieve anything. And he worried that Black people in Brampton and Mississauga and Toronto and Canada, African Canadians, because of streaming, as you mentioned, because of institutional racism, because of perceptions of gangs, or, whatever it is, don't have that same sort of ambition educated into them, given to them, and they're diminished in their potential achievements. Is that a problem?
It is a problem. It's when you have somebody who is a parent who doesn't understand the school system. English is not necessarily their primary language, and even it is not as comfortable. They're easily intimidated by authority. And when you go into a school and a teacher tells you something, they're more educated than you tend to listen to what they have to say, whether it's right or wrong.
Right.
And I know my mother had to go and fight, because I have 3 siblings, and had to go in and fight for each and every one of us to make sure we weren't put into
where'd you grow up? Where'd you grow up, and where were you educated?
Well, I came to Canada when I was 6 years old, and then I lived in North York for 8 years, and then I moved to Ottawa, and I lived in Ottawa for 20 years, right through high school and university.
And then what took you to Calgary?
What took me to Calgary was a job opportunity in Seattle. I was coming back to Canada, and I thought that I would look for a place for my family I think would be a better fit. And I was told to take a look at Calgary, and it turned out to be everything that was supposed to be.
I asked Mr. Jolly the other day if he had experienced racism in his life, and he laughed and he said, every blank day. Have you experienced racism?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I had a university professor, second year, grab me from the States, tell me that I couldn't possibly get an 89 on that paper. I had to have cheated because I'm black and I'm too stupid. There's no possible way I could have got that mark. I had some choice words for him. Many times. And I wouldn't say I'm overall a victim, because I would confront some of those issues head on. That's not something I'm most proud of, but I wasn't a victim, and I didn't end up being one.
We're chatting with Lindsay Blackett, a Canadian politician, at least a former Canadian politician, I hope a politician again in the future, about institutional racism, about Black Lives Matters, about the protests in the United States, about what's going to happen in the future. We're going to take a quick break, come back for more with Lindsay in just a minute. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Hour. We're chatting tonight with Lindsay Blackett, a gentleman that I've had on my show about a month ago, talking about the protests in the United States just after those protests occurred. And I wanted to have him back because, Lindsay, you've been a politician, so you know the ebb and flow of political stories and of issues, and people in news and politics will say that, it's a 24-hour cycle and things are over and you get onto something else. But this time it feels different to me. And I'm not sure whether it's because everyone was sitting at home in COVID-19 and so therefore they were watching the news, or because it was so much more personal, having a guy's knee, not a guy, a policeman's knee on a neck for 9 minutes, and we all saw that, it was videotaped, or whether it's social media that then, amplified it out. But it feels different for me this time than all the numerous times that you mentioned earlier and that other people have mentioned earlier. Am I right? Is this time different?
I think it is different. I sense it from people. I've had no less than 15, 16 friends, and I've asked them all, so what is your conversation like with your teenagers or young adults in your house? And they all to a person say, my kids say, we don't get it. And I said, that's why I feel that it's changing.
Because they don't get what? They don't get the police brutality?
The people don't get that institutional racism happens, is happening, or happened before. People live their lives, and I'm not saying everybody should know about it, but it was plain for people to see if they chose to see, but most people didn't live a life that they would encounter that. So I can't blame them for that, but their children won't excuse them for not knowing.
Now, is this your kids or white kids as well?
My kids, white kids, mainly the ones I'm talking about, white kids. And they're saying, yeah, Dad, duh. Yeah, Mom, duh. It happens. It's not acceptable. We're going to change it. The other part that people don't understand, there's a generation, that Generation Z, 22 and under. It is voted the most optimistic of the last 5 generations. It's the first generation that have had technology from the time they were able to put it in their hands. That also meant they've been on the internet since they were 3 or 4. They've been able to fact check. They can use those smart boards in their classrooms much better than their teachers can. The teachers in school, the older faculty members have a hard time keeping up with an 8-year-old. And that's a fact. And I think that the chickens have come home to roost. I think young people have looked at our generations and said, how could we have put ourselves into this spot and you haven't done anything to change it? We're prepared to make those changes. We're prepared to make those tough decisions.
So why is that? It's interesting because, you talked a bit on the last panel, and we've talked before a lot about Martin Luther King. And you think about what a dynamic, inspirational leadership gentleman that was. He had, huge protests in Washington that we've all seen the videos of. Robert Kennedy were assassinated. One would have thought, that would have been a catalyst to a major change, and it wasn't.
But you had to look at America. America wasn't going to change. The people who had the power, those southern states that they're still crying over their statues, their Confederate statues today, they weren't going to take those down. Somebody asked me, why don't they melt those statues down? I said, you do not want to incite people to act, because that's not going to end well. You've got to understand, that happened. A lot of people were angry. I watched those funerals as a young boy. I was moved for them, but I never thought for a moment that there was going to be change. The Kennedys were going to get killed, and that life would move on.
But now there is change, and why? So is it because we've seen a president that's an African American? Is that the change? It's because we've seen Black people on TV and film and in lots of other things, and so therefore the new generation just accept it? Or my son's comment would be, Dad, we play sports with them. We're in high school with them. Like, it's just not an issue anymore. So is it that we see people, at the highest levels achieving success, or is it that people are just making friends across racial divides today that they didn't maybe in the past?
Right. I think it's a combination thereof. But from our kids' standpoint, that's it. We hang out with them. We walk amongst them. You look in my class. I've got Muslim. I've got Jewish. I've got people from the Middle East. I've got people representing any of the world. Duh. It's so I think that's part of it. I think that you start at least see a lot more diversity on screen, especially Netflix pushed a lot of that. Hollywood was pushing back for the longest time on people, for those writers, those producers, those jobs, unless they're people of color, visible minorities, or First Nations. I don't think that's right. Two wrongs don't make a right, but I think people just saw it and they want to make it so. They can see the leap, and now they just want to push us to that leap.
So you've obviously achieved great success. I mentioned a couple of other people, and we had them on the panel with you. How have you broken through whatever obstacles were put in your way? What were the secrets to your personal success?
Well, secret, my dad always told me, I hated to hear it. He's an Oxford grad. He was the first one of his family to ever go to school. And he says you have to be twice as good. And there's nothing wrong with you being twice as good, because you're capable of being twice as good. Most people my age that are Black would have a lot of that same mentality.
Desmond Jolly said the exact same thing to me, that his father told him he had to be twice as good.
Right. So when I'm in Prime Minister's office at 22, I know I have to be twice as good as somebody else that's working across the hall from me. Whenever I went to a job, there was always that in the back of my mind initially, but later on I realized that, just like I can play hockey with anybody, I can actually go and compete with anybody and stop worrying about me and who I am. I know I'm Black. Everybody can see that I am. It's not going to hold me back. It doesn't define who I am. I'm going to strive to be the best I can be. not just be twice as good to be equal, twice as good to be best. And that's a difference that I wouldn't have had 20 years ago. I'm not sure that many people have had that 20 years ago, but my kids certainly have it, and they don't even blink.
So is it something that that people need, inspirational father figures or teachers, educators, whatever, that's going to be able to deliver that message to them? Or
Sure.
frankly, is it even fair anymore that we have to be twice as good?
Well, I don't know if it's fair or not. If you have, well, I'd like to have equality. I'd strive for that. I don't think affirmative action is what it needs to be, but that was my father's way of saying, don't expect to wait for somebody to give you something. You got to go earn it. And I think your question is appropriate, though, because there's a lot of people who are looking for role models. I look at a Joel McGinley. You look at a guy named John Ware, who was a cowboy that turned the century in Alberta, who had 2,000 people show up for his funeral. It wasn't because he was black. It was just because he was a good person. And that is what we have to celebrate, not just on Black History Month, because I don't celebrate a lot of Black History Month. I said, I'm just as good in December as I am in February or January, and I don't mean to be flippant about it, but we need to see, what we need to transition, though, is in the US and Canada and many other countries, Blacks think that they've arrived because they've got a political office. The president of the United States was Black. Big freaking deal. The fact of the matter is, if banks don't give loans to Black businesses who hire Black employees or visible minority employees or First Nations employees, nothing's going to change. You have to give the power, and the power is in the mighty dollar. And people have to be able to be self-sufficient and be able to hire who they want and be successful in the businesses that they choose. That's a tough decision for people to have. Tough conversation for people to have. And tell me there's not systemic racism in banking. Holy crap.
Yeah, there is.
That's just not so.
Okay, so how do we make the change? If we got systemic racism in education, and as you know, the Peel Board of Education, Minister of Education just took it over and put in place a supervisor and took away the responsibility from the Board of Trustees because of supposed institutional racism at the board level and potentially within the administration as well. I spoke with a counselor from Toronto, Shelley Carroll, who used to be on the Board of Education in Toronto, and she said over 80% of the detention meetings that they have, where it goes up to a higher level and the trustees have to get involved, were with African Canadians, with Black people. And she said, like, you know, disproportionately so. If a white person did something wrong, they were told stop it. If a Black person did something wrong, they were given a detention, and suspensions, certainly the same. You know, we certainly have this problem in the legal system. I interviewed the first person of color that's president of the Canadian Bar Association. She's also from Jamaica. And she said that there was institutional racism within the legal system, even more so within the penal system. But interesting enough, she said it was worse for Indigenous people than it was even for Black people. We've you know, had lots of people talk about institutional racism within police forces. Where do we start?
Well, you know, the funny thing is, it's all happening now. Like, look at the changes for those U.S. professional teams, the Redskins, the Chiefs. They're all forced to change. This all came about as the whole Black Lives Matter just shone a microscope on everything they would do, and we're screwing like little rats and cockroaches because, now what do we have to do? You know, Daniel Snyder, I'm not doing that. Well, you know, when the Fred Smith from FedEx, who's got your naming rights, says, hey, I'm a minority owner, and we want to make this change, and Nike wants to make this change, and those other people want to make this change. When you get big players, whatever their motivation is to make those changes, it's cataclysmic. That's what's going to happen in the banking industry, because there's going to be, it'll be an expose. Most people, well, that can't be happening. Well, when it's exposed and people have one thing they can do, they can withdraw their service. And I think that there will be boycotts. There will be things that happen organically over time to force pressure to be able to create equality in access to finance.
We're chatting tonight with Lindsay. We're chatting tonight with Lindsay Blackett, a Canadian politician. We find him tonight in Calgary. We're going to take a quick break and come back for more with Lindsay in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, we're back with Lindsay Blackett, Canadian politician, nice guy, Calgary, Alberta today, but formerly of Toronto, formerly, I guess, of Seattle, formerly of Ottawa, formerly of, where did you come? You said you came from, when you were 6, where were you born?
England. London, England.
London, England, and then you came here. And and you said your dad went to Oxford.
Yes.
What's the story? How did he get to Oxford?
He got there on a scholarship. First child in the family to get there. Highly intelligent. He went there to study accounting. Graduated on time. Went to apply for jobs. Had a stellar accent. Well educated. Yeah, we'd love to have you. He showed up. They looked and saw a black man. Sorry, the position's filled. This happened 10 or 15 times. And then in the end, he decided to move to Canada. And it was a Jewish firm in England who gave him the only opportunity to be hired. It was a Jewish firm in Canada. It was the first opportunity until he was hired by the Auditor General, who said, you have the credentials we want, and never looked back. But yeah, painful time, good memories, good lesson for me to learn. Yep. Because I never had a degree from Oxford, and even having one didn't guarantee anything. So hard work and perseverance makes it happen. Having some friends and seeing them successful, people of color. But I still today can't understand why women are treated the way that they are. You know, when you go to university or you're going to college, you're in high school, there's equal amount of women that are smarter than the guys. But somehow 15, 20 years later, when you get into the workforce, all of a sudden the guys are making more. And it never changes. I think all of these things, and it's more pervasive for women of color, but I think they're going to change, and it's not through affirmative action. I think we need to go look at the law we have on the books. I happen to write the Human Rights Bill in Alberta. It says 3 protection against discrimination, for access to employment, for access to accommodation, and access to government services. Surely it's not a stretch to ask those governments to rewrite that legislation to provide for discrimination by government services and government employees.
Now, I wouldn't have thought about the Conservative Party of Alberta as being one of the most progressive political institutions in Canada. How were you accepted within the Progressive Conservative Party in Alberta?
Not a problem. People in Alberta didn't care that I was black. They cared that I was a conservative, or I had some ideas, I was bona fide. When I got elected, I was elected in the largest riding in the province. And it was twice as large as any other riding. It was 70,000 people, got split in this after I decided not to run again into 2 ridings. And there wasn't an issue. There was some, that you can't please everybody, but I got 58% of the vote. And it didn't matter. I haven't experienced a lot of racism in Alberta. I'm not naive, but I got to a spot that I didn't have to continuously prove myself. I got to a place where I had my own privilege. And
why so in politics today?
Pardon? Why am I not in politics today? Because I can't deal with a lot of the BS that is required in politics. I'm a conservative, but I'm not a devout puppy that believes everything a leader or a party espouses is pablum that I have to suck up and then pass on to my constituents. I was there to represent constituents. I would do the right thing by them, make sure their dollars were spent wisely in the areas that mattered to them, such as healthcare, education, post-secondary, etc. I left because I didn't get along with the incoming premier, who we had a long political history, and it was just best to leave. As it turned out, it worked out pretty well because she imploded. I could go back. I just choose not to right now.
A lot of us in Toronto were surprised when we elected Rob Ford as the then current mayor of Toronto that Calgary elected a Muslim Nenshi.
Yep. I spent a lot of time in Ontario and Quebec as part of the provincial government, showing that, you know, they want to show there's diversity in our caucus. That was before Nayad Nenshi got elected, who my son predicted with his grade 4 class 6 months in advance, by the way. He was polling at 2 to 4% in the polls. That's why that generation not only impresses me, but they're scary smart. Yeah, and everybody laughed is that you had the mayor we should have had and vice versa. Not really. It's just that's the image that people had. But if you look through, and I found that out through when we debated our human rights bill, Albertans were rated number 1 in terms of religious indifference or religious tolerance. They had the most number per capita of same-sex marriages in the country.
Really? That is surprising. I would not have thought about that.
I know. But, and here we are. And, yeah, and not to say racism wasn't here, it was here, but people in parts of Alberta were able to vote in the turn of the century when you couldn't vote in Nova Scotia until 1954 if you're a black person.
So you've mentioned a couple of times that you're not supportive of affirmative action. Why?
Because affirmative action, when that person gets put into that position, they know they get put into that position. Everybody around them gets put in that position. I've had siblings who've been promoted that way, and I told them, don't do it, and they will regret it. Friends who've done it and regret it. Because you think you're being equal because you've got that position, but it's an asterisk beside you. And you're not carrying the flame for us. The people who carry the flame for us are the people who stand up and put themselves forward in any wake of life to excel. You're not there to go get something cushy just to fill a number. You want to go and create change. You want to create a better life for you and your kids and your generation of your people.
Okay, so affirmative action doesn't work. Streaming, you've talked about that. Streaming obviously is a problem. How do we change that? Do we just get rid of it? Or do we have black-only schools? Or do we have more inspirational black teachers and administration? What's the solution there?
I think it's what we have. It's equality is the answer. It's the hard goal to get to because you can't just legislate it. You can't just wave your hand and make it so, like affirmative action. I want to have 100 new people in senior government positions in the next 3 months. Make it so. What have you changed? Nothing. You've put some people in those positions, but you haven't empowered them. So what we need to do, I think, is instead of the streaming, is that you have to provide education that deals with everybody. You can't just put people in a class and ignore the people who are struggling and say that's okay. If you do, then your education system's failing. So how do we address that? How do we address the needs of those people who aren't being met? And not to say everybody's going to be post-secondary. Only 17% of our population does. But everybody has the right to have a chance, a shot at it. And
what about black-only schools? Do you support that?
No. What? That's segregation. That's reverse segregation. I mean, if you want to do it, sure, we have Muslim-only schools, we have Jewish schools, we have Chinese schools, we have all those. That's choice, I get. But I think you are, unless you are going to be the next Brown or the next school that's going to, if you focus on on excellence, that's great. But most of the time, it's going to focus on trying to be accommodating as opposed to providing the students with the best education, because that's what they need.
Yeah, my concern is that Black-only schools sort of admit that you can't have equality in the regular schools. And so far better to create the equality in the regular schools, even though, as you say, that's the hard work that you got to do. But that's the right objective in the end.
Yeah, and I think it's not as difficult here. There's pockets that it's going to be problems in certain urban centers, in large cities, but for overall, I don't think it's as big an issue if we try to address it.
Okay, what about the police force? Should we be defunding police force? Lots of people say, and this isn't necessarily a color issue. Actually, it's certainly not a color issue, but that people with mental health problems should not be, police shouldn't be the first line of approach from a governmental agency. And in the past, in different jurisdictions, and even in Toronto, there were paramedics that were trained psychologists or psychiatrists or whatnot that were the first people to go for mental health. And too often, people with mental health issues are confronted by police people that are yelling at them, put down the knife or open the door or whatever it is. So some of the defund police campaigns have been saying we need to put more money into paramedics that are better trained from a psychological standpoint. But it also would appear that, at least in the United States, don't know if it exists in Canada, though some people think it is, that there is an attitude within the police force of police brutality, racism, systematic racism. It's the history of carding, the history of typing people. Mm-hmm. What's the solution in policing?
Well, the solution in policing, again, is you've got to get equality. Every police force is dealing with incidents of sexual abuse, sexual harassment of women in police force. Toronto, Ottawa, Calgary, Edmonton, doesn't matter. Montreal doesn't matter. They all have it. So the system, and not everybody, but a lot of policemen have bouncer mentality. I was contacted by a couple of members of the Calgary Police Force after I wrote my article and said, you got to keep on speaking up about it because it needs to change. We're not all bad people. We're not saying that. But I know, for instance, we've asked police to do way too much. We asked them to serve and protect, but they asked them to be social workers. We asked them to be the first line there to go deal with a heart attack. We expect them to be saints and also protect us when we need to protect it. You can't have it both ways. And so maybe we take some of that people that are, the mentally ill. We as a society 10, 20, 30 years ago decided that we didn't want to institutionalize and try to treat mental patients. We just throw them out on the street. And now we have to clean up that mess. But for the cost of $150,000, I think, is in Alberta for every homeless person, that's spent in the hospitals and it's spent in our legal system. And that's not just police. That's our crown attorneys that are now having to be involved in that. And some of this can be avoided without having to put people into the system. And just as so you commit an act, is there a chance for restitution, or does it have to be hard time in a school of crime where you're going to come out worse than you are? The recidivist rate when I studied criminology at Carleton University in 1972 is no different today. If anything, it's probably worse.
No, I interviewed
and it's not blacks. You're right. It's First Nation.
But I interviewed a former gang leader who was suspended something like 29 times, went to prison a couple of times, and she said the best training she got in being a gang member was in prison.
Right. No, you're not helping anybody, and the sooner that we make sure that we can divert people from that system of crime, because we're going to have to deal with them again as society. It's just going to be a higher cost for us every time that they're let out and reoffend. They're hardened criminals now after they come out of that system. The chances of rehabilitation are gone.
But we do have a disproportionate number in our population of the prison system of blacks and of
Mhm.
Aboriginals, far greater than their percentage
Right.
in the population. And once again, I'm not sure if it's true, but I've been told that a white person and a black person charged with the same thing, the Crown prosecutor will load up the black person with a whole bunch of charges and won't do the same thing with the white person. And so it's far more difficult for the black person to get through the legal system.
Right. I don't have any anecdotal evidence, but I do claim that is probably true. What we need to do is find out why are the rates of incarceration, why are the rates of conviction so much higher for those disproportionate groups? And is there some way that we can address that as a root cause, as opposed to having society have to go through all the systemic change when it in fact is it's the system focusing on a few.
We're chatting tonight with Lindsay Blackett, a Canadian politician coming to us from Calgary, Alberta right now. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us.
Yep.
Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Fascinating chat this evening with Lindsay Blackett, a Canadian politician, comes to us from Calgary, Alberta. Said he worked in the PMO when he was 22. Is that true?
Correct. Yep.
What did you do, and who is the Prime Minister?
Prime Minister was Brian Mulroney. And Brian Mulroney, I was hired on a 2-week contract. I was hired through an agency, so he really didn't know I was there until I showed up at some events. But I did a good enough job that kept me around for a couple of years, and I got involved in politics. I ran my first campaign that year, and Greg Vezina was a candidate. And by the time I left there, I'd run 10 campaigns.
Fantastic.
So I got indoctrinated, I was accepted, and I was schooled by some of the best. And I learned what they learned, and I said to my kids, I'm going to pass that on to you. I'm going to pass it on to my friends' kids, the ones that don't already have that privilege, and show that, we can do it. But Brian Mulroney was hugely supportive, and the issue of what I was or who I was never came up.
Lindsay, some of the protests in the United States were taken over by looters. They became riots. What's your read of what happened there?
Well, I think one of the reasons that for optimism is that, after 40 years of watching all these race riots and the protests that turn ugly, is that the protesters themselves realized they weren't going to allow themselves to be duped anymore. They realized that a gang of thugs, whether you're in Seattle, it's a couple of gangs that go out to Bellevue to wreak havoc and make it look like the tens of 20 or 1,000 protesters instead of 20 or 30 people are agitating. You had people start to lock arms around these businesses and protect them. You had people now jumping on these looters and holding them for police and making citizens arrest. Not Seattle, but across the country. I think people saw that the protesters were not allowing themselves to be duped, and they saw that they were protecting property, they were doing the right thing, and they were just peaceful protesters trying to make change. And I think some people, I can't say what percentage, realized that, holy crap, this has been going on for a while. The KKK used to infiltrate these rallies in the 60s and hire young blacks to go and beat up on other young blacks so it make us all look bad. And all you have to do is roll your eyes, because there's nothing else you can do, because you're not going anywhere, because you can't get the mainstream of society to support your cause. I think
that's one of the things that changed. And I'm not sure, number one, I agree with you. I think that the looting was bad, but somewhat controlled, particularly after a while. But I think the thing that encouraged me the most is the number of white young people that joined the protests.
Yes. Well, all brothers and sisters, right? It's just, as my friends' kids would say, and most of them did go to the protests and were there. And the parents said, well, and they said, there's no choice. We're going to do that. We're going to show solidarity, because it could be me on some day on some other issue. and I want to know that other people will support me.
Lindsay, if I asked you to speak to a group of young black men right tonight, what would you say to them?
I would say to them, first and foremost, is that we as black men have to be strong fathers, because a lot of the problems that are encountered in our own communities are not the fault of police. They're the fault of the fact that we haven't stood up and become proper role models to our males and females, our young people in our families, and be there to support them, help them with their homework, help them stay straight of the law, and help them to be successful adults. That's why the Million Man March mattered, why it's still needed, and we can't absolve ourselves from our own responsibility. We have it within us to be better, and we have to demand that of ourselves.
And if Brian Mulroney or Justin Trudeau or some current prime minister that you actually support hired you to write the race relations speech, what would you have the Prime Minister of Canada say today about race relations in Canada?
I say about race relations today in Canada, it's not a perfect animal. We have evolved. We have improved. We are better than we were 10 years ago, but we're not better than we will be 10 years from now. We have an opportunity where our young people mixed with our seniors recognize that changes need to be had. We need to work together to come up with a framework to be able to address the changes that need to be created to battle systemic racism in education, in our legal system, in our government departments.
Lindsay Blackett, thanks for joining us tonight. I got to tell you, I've got more positive feeling for what's going to happen with race relations in Canada and the United States than I probably have since the election of President Obama. And I hope that we're not wrong. I hope that what's happened with the protests in the United States is the catalyst to change, and it keeps on going. And I think you're right that the big issue is that lots of people joined in, the whole community joined in, and it became an issue for everyone, particularly young people. And I think that that's almost an unstoppable wave that's going to change our societies. And I think obviously for the good. So thanks for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for what you do. You talking, using your platform to have this discussion, and many, that helps big time.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Enjoy it.
Okay.
So that's Lindsay Blackett on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. Thanks for joining us. Have a good evening.